October 2019, Fort Bragg. A decorated general sat quietly in the corner of the mess hall as a group of cocky Delta Force operators openly mocked an old veteran's jagged scar, laughing about desk job wounds and stolen valor. But when the general slowly rolled up his own sleeve to reveal a nearly identical mark, the room went dead silent, because what happened next would change how these elite soldiers viewed courage forever. What could possibly connect these two scars that made hardened special operators question everything they thought they knew about real combat? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October sun hadn't yet broken through the morning haze at Fort Bragg when Staff Sergeant Marcus Holloway pushed through the double doors of the Delta Force compound mess hall. At 28, Holloway was the youngest team leader in his unit, a fact he wore like a badge of honor. His combat boots struck the linoleum with the confident rhythm of someone who'd earned his place among America's most elite warriors. Behind him filed in the rest of his team, 6 men, whose names struck fear in enemy combatants across 3 continents. There was Chen, the quiet Californian sniper who could thread a needle at 1,000 yards. Rodriguez from Texas, built like a linebacker and twice as mean when things got hot. Patterson, the explosives expert who spoke in percentages and probabilities. Williams, their medic, who'd saved more lives in firefights than most surgeons saw in a year. Jackson, the communications specialist who could hack into anything with a power source. And finally Brooks, the youngest at 24. Still eager to prove himself with every mission, they'd returned from Somalia just 18 hours earlier. Another successful operation that would never make the news, never be declassified, never earn them public recognition. That was fine by Holloway. The only recognition that mattered came from the men in this room, the brotherhood of operators who understood what it meant to walk into hell and walk back out. "Grab your trays." "Gentlemen," Holloway said, his Carolina drawl more pronounced after the long flight home, "we've got debriefing at 0900, so eat fast." The mess hall was already half full with other special operations personnel, mostly Rangers and a few Green Berets, all moving with that same economy of motion that marked them as different from regular army. The smell of coffee, eggs, and bacon filled the air, simple food that tasted like heaven after 2 weeks of MREs in the African bush. As they loaded their trays, Holloway noticed an older man sitting alone in the far corner of the mess hall. He wore civilian clothes, a worn flannel shirt and jeans, but something about his bearing screamed military. The man had to be in his 70s, his white hair cropped military short, his posture ramrod straight despite his age. He ate slowly, methodically, his eyes distant as if watching something no one else could see. "Check out the fossil in the corner," Brooks muttered, loud enough for the team to hear. "Someone's grandfather get lost on his way to the VFW?" A few chuckles rippled through the group as they found a table near the center of the room. Holloway glanced back at the old man, but said nothing. Fort Bragg occasionally hosted veterans for various ceremonies and events. The guy was probably here for some awards dinner or reunion. They settled into their breakfast, the conversation turning to their recent operation. Rodriguez was in the middle of describing a near miss with an RPG when the old man stood up to bus his tray. That's when Brooks saw it. "Holy hell," Brooks said, pointing with his fork. "Look at that scar." The old man's left arm, exposed by his rolled-up sleeve, bore a vicious scar that ran from just below his elbow nearly to his wrist. The tissue was raised and twisted, the kind of mark left by serious trauma that had healed decades ago without the benefit of modern surgical techniques. "Probably cut himself gardening," Patterson said, smirking. "You know how dangerous those rose bushes can be." The table erupted in laughter. Even Holloway felt a grin tugging at his lips. There was something about the disconnect. This elderly civilian shuffling through their compound with what looked like a serious combat injury. "I'm telling you." Rodriguez leaned in conspiratorially. "That's a classic I fell off a ladder scar. My uncle has one just like it. Tried to tell everyone it was from Nam, but we all knew he got it installing gutters in Milwaukee. Stolen valor at its finest, Chen added quietly, though his voice carried. Desk jockeys who never saw combat love to show off their war wounds at places like this. Makes them feel like they were part of something. Williams, usually the voice of reason, shook his head. Come on, guys. We don't know his story. Don't need to, Brooks shot back. Look at him. He's what, 75? Even if he served, he was probably fixing typewriters in West Germany during the Cold War. No real action. That's scars from something stupid, and he knows it, which is why he's eating alone, pretending he can't hear us. The laughter grew louder, drawing attention from nearby tables. A few rangers glanced over, some smiling at the obvious ribbing of the old civilian. This was the culture. Hard men who'd earned their place through blood and sacrifice, protective of their brotherhood, skeptical of anyone who seemed to be playing dress-up with military credibility. Holloway watched the old man's back as he slowly made his way toward the exit. There was something about his gait, a slight hitch in his step that spoke of old injuries. But Brooks was right. Fort Bragg saw its share of wannabes and exaggerators, guys who'd spent their service careers in supply depots, but told war stories at bars like they'd been kicking down doors in Fallujah. Bet you $20, Jackson said, that if we asked him about it, he'd have some bullshit story about classified operations he can't talk about. They always do. Classified dishwashing operations, Patterson added, setting off another round of laughter. The old man stopped at the door. For just a moment, his shoulders tensed, and Holloway wondered if he'd heard them after all. But then he pushed through, disappearing into the morning light, and the moment passed. All right, enough, Holloway said, though he was still grinning. Finish up. We've got work to do. They returned to their breakfast, the conversation shifting to upcoming training exercises and speculation about their next deployment. The old man was forgotten. Just another random encounter in the constant flow of people through the base. None of them noticed the two-star general who'd been sitting 3 tables away, partially obscured by a support column, his breakfast growing cold as he listened to every word. Major General Robert Thorne had been at Fort Bragg for a conference on special operations integration, taking his breakfast early to avoid the usual crowd of officers seeking FaceTime with brass. He'd watched the whole exchange in silence, his jaw tightening with each mocking comment. Thorne knew exactly who that old man was, though he'd only met him once, years ago, at a classified briefing that still gave him nightmares when he thought about it too hard. The general stood slowly, his own considerable frame still imposing despite his 52 years. He'd spent 30 years in Special Forces before his current posting, with more combat deployments than most of these young operators would see in their entire careers. He'd earned his stars the hard way, and he hadn't forgotten where he came from, or the men who'd paved the way. Thorne walked deliberately toward Holloway's table, his boots clicking on the floor with measured precision. The Delta operators noticed him approaching, their postures straightening automatically, conversation dying mid-sentence. You didn't make it to Delta without being able to read a room. And the expression on the general's face was crystal clear. Someone had screwed up badly. Staff Sergeant Holloway, Thorne said, his voice carrying the flat, dangerous calm of barely controlled anger. A word. All of you, now. The 7 operators exchanged glances, confusion mixing with the first tendrils of dread. They stood as one, following the general toward the exit the old man had taken just moments before. As they stepped into the morning light, Holloway's mind raced. Had they compromised operational security discussing Somalia? Had someone lodged a complaint about their behavior? Or was this about something else entirely, something to do with the old man they'd just mocked? The general led them around the corner of the building to a small courtyard, deserted at this early hour. Only then did he turn to face them, his eyes hard as flint. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "you just made the worst mistake of your military careers. And before this day is over, you're going to understand exactly why." The 7 Delta Force operators stood frozen, the morning suddenly feeling much colder than it had just minutes before. The silence in the courtyard stretched like a wire pulled taut. 7 of America's most elite warriors stood at attention, though the general hadn't ordered it. It was instinct, born from years of military discipline and the unmistakable recognition that they were in serious trouble. Major General Thorne let the silence work for him. He'd learned long ago that the anticipation of punishment was often worse than the punishment itself. He studied each face in turn, Holloway's jaw set in that way leaders do when they know their team is about to pay for something. Brooks looking younger than his 24 years. Rodriguez's usual cocky demeanor evaporated like morning dew. "Do any of you," Thorne finally spoke, his voice low and controlled, "have the slightest idea who that man was?" Holloway's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "No, sir. A civilian visiting the base, we assumed—" "You assumed." Thorne's interruption was surgical. "You assumed, and based on that assumption, you decided to mock a man's combat wounds in a room full of operators. Tell me, Staff Sergeant, what part of your training taught you that was acceptable behavior?" "Sir, we didn't know they were combat wounds," Brooks interjected, then immediately wished he hadn't. Thorne's gaze swiveled to the young operator like a gun turret acquiring a target. "You didn't know? So your default position, when seeing an elderly man with a catastrophic scar at Fort Bragg, arguably the most significant special operations installation in the world, was to assume he was lying about how he got it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Brooks opened his mouth, then closed it. "There was no good answer. That man," Thorne continued, beginning to pace slowly in front of them, "is Walter Cunningham. Does that name mean anything to any of you?" 7 heads shook in unison. "Of course it doesn't. Walter Cunningham was never on the cover of magazines. His operations were never turned into movies. The missions he ran were so far beyond classified that most of them are still buried in vaults that won't be opened for another 50 years. But let me educate you, gentlemen, about the man you just humiliated." Thorne stopped pacing, his eyes distant, accessing memories from briefings and conversations most people would never be cleared to hear. Walter Cunningham enlisted in the Army in 1968, right in the thick of Vietnam. He wasn't drafted, he volunteered. By 1970, he was running reconnaissance missions in Laos and Cambodia, the kind of work that officially never happened. MACVSOG. You boys know what that was. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. Studies and Observations Group, Holloway answered quietly. Unconventional Warfare Unit. That's the sanitized version, yes. The real version. They were ghosts. Cross-border operations, prisoner snatches, wiretaps on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Direct action missions so deep in denied territory that if they got captured, the U.S. government would disavow any knowledge of their existence. Williams shifted his weight uncomfortably. Every operator knew the concept plausible. Deniability was still part of their world. But MACVSOG had written the playbook on it decades. Before Delta Force even existed, Cunningham ran over 60 missions into Laos, Thorne continued. 60. The average SOG operator lasted 6 months before they were dead, captured, or too broken to continue. He did it for 3 years. 3 years of walking into some of the most heavily defended territory in Southeast Asia with 5 or 6 men, against NVA regiments that numbered in the thousands. The general's voice took on an edge that made Holloway's stomach knot. On February 15, 1972, Cunningham's recon team was inserted into the A Shau Valley to locate a suspected NVA headquarters. Their Huey took ground fire on insertion. The pilot was killed, and the bird went down hard. 3 of Cunningham's 6-man team died in the crash. The survivors, Cunningham and 2 others, were surrounded by an entire NVA battalion within 30 minutes. Chen, who rarely spoke, cleared his throat. "How did they fought for 19 hours, Thorne said flatly. 19 hours, 3 men against hundreds. They had 1 radio, and it was damaged in the crash. Cunningham climbed a tree under heavy fire to extend the antenna range far enough to call for extraction. He was hit twice by rifle fire while hanging onto that tree, once in the leg, once in the arm. That scar you gentlemen found so amusing? That's where an AK round shattered his radius and ulna. The bones were so badly damaged that field surgeons nearly amputated. He refused. The weight of shame was settling on the group like a physical thing. Rodriguez looked like he might be sick. The extraction bird couldn't land, Thorne went on relentlessly. The LZ was too hot. So Cunningham, with his arm held together by little more than skin and sheer will, rigged a jungle penetrator and hauled his 2 wounded teammates onto it, one at a time, while providing covering fire with his good arm. Then and only then did he allow himself to be extracted. Jesus, Patterson whispered. Both of his teammates survived. Cunningham spent 8 months in military hospitals, underwent 6 surgeries, and still never regained full mobility in that arm. The doctors told him his combat days were over. He was 23 years old, and he'd already done enough for 3 lifetimes. Know what he did? No one answered. They didn't need to. He requalified for combat duty, learned to shoot left-handed, went through every painful physical therapy session and every humiliating requalification test until the Army had no choice but to put him back in the field. He did 2 more tours in Vietnam, then spent the next 15 years in classified operations across Central America, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Places you've never heard of, doing things that will never be declassified. Thorne stepped closer to Holloway, close enough that the staff sergeant could see the genuine anger in the general's eyes. That man has more combat decorations than your entire team combined, but you'll never see them, because most of his citations are classified at levels you don't have clearance for. He's been shot 17 times, stabbed 4 times, and has survived things that would have killed lesser men. He spent 42 years serving this country in the shadows, and when he finally retired, he did so quietly, without fanfare, because that's the kind of man he is. Brooks looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. Sir, we didn't know? Thorne's voice cracked like a whip. No, you didn't know, because you didn't bother to think. You saw an old man with a scar and immediately assumed he was a fraud, a wannabe, someone trying to steal the valor that you believe belongs only to your generation. You're not the first young operators to make that mistake, and you won't be the last. But today, right now, you're going to learn why that assumption is not just wrong, it's insulting to every man and woman who came before you and paved the way for units like Delta Force to even exist. The general pulled up his own sleeve, revealing his right forearm. There, running parallel to where Cunningham's scar was located, lay an eerily similar mark, though smaller, cleaner, the product of better surgical intervention. Afghanistan 2003, Thorne said quietly. I was a captain then, leading an ODA team in the Paktika province. We got into a firefight with Taliban forces, and I took shrapnel from an RPG. It shattered my forearm in 3 places. I spent 4 months in recovery, underwent multiple surgeries with the best military medical care available. Even with all that modern medicine, I still have limited mobility and chronic pain. He let his sleeve fall back down. My injury came with morphine, surgical steel pins, physical therapy in climate-controlled facilities, and a medical system designed to put me back together as efficiently as possible. Cunningham got his wound treated in a field hospital with basic antibiotics and surgery, performed by a doctor who'd been awake for 36 hours straight. They picked bone fragments out of his arm with forceps and sewed him up with whatever they had on hand. The infections nearly killed him 3 times during his recovery. The general's voice softened, but only slightly. So when I see a scar like his, gentlemen, I don't see a joke. I don't see stolen valor. I see a man who paid a price you can't begin to understand, in a war that was so brutal and unforgiving that it broke the soul of this nation. I see a warrior who deserves your respect, not your mockery. Holloway finally found his voice, though it came out rough. So what can we do to make this right? Thorne looked at each of them in turn, measuring, evaluating. Walter Cunningham is here for the next 3 days as a guest speaker for a classified conference on unconventional warfare tactics. This afternoon at 1400 hours, you will all attend his presentation. You will sit in the front row, and afterward you will apologize to him personally. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," came the unified response. Dismissed. The 7 operators turned to leave, but Thorne's voice stopped them. "Gentlemen, one more thing. You're all exceptional at your jobs. You've earned your place in Delta Force, but never ever forget that you stand on the shoulders of men like Walter Cunningham. Without them, without their sacrifices and their lessons learned in blood, you wouldn't have the training, the tactics, or the legacy that makes you the best in the world. Remember that." As they walked away, none of them spoke. The weight of their mistake hung heavy, but it was more than that. For the first time in their careers, these young operators understood that being elite wasn't just about what you could do. It was about honoring those who'd done it first, in conditions far worse than anything they'd ever faced. And in a few hours, they would have to look Walter Cunningham in the eye and admit that they'd failed to understand that fundamental truth. The debriefing at 0900 was the longest hour of Marcus Holloway's career. He sat in the secure briefing room with his team, surrounded by classified documents and mission photos from Somalia, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. Across the table, the intelligence officer was walking through their operation timeline, asking standard questions about enemy movements and civilian presence. But Holloway's responses were mechanical. Autopilot. All he could see was that old man's back, walking out of the mess hall while they laughed. When the debriefing finally ended, the team filed out in uncharacteristic silence. Usually, after a successful mission, they'd be energized, already planning how to spend their downtime, swapping stories about close calls that seemed funnier with distance. Today, they walked like men, heading to their own execution. Staff Sergeant Holloway. Marcus turned to find Captain Sarah Mendoza, the Delta Force psychologist, standing in the hallway. She was in her late 30s, sharp-eyed, with the kind of presence that made even the most hardened operators think twice before lying to her. "Captain," he acknowledged. "I heard about this morning," she said, falling into step beside him. "Word travels fast around here." "I bet it does." Holloway's voice was flat. They walked in silence for a moment before Mendoza spoke again. "You know what the hardest part of elite units is, Marcus. It's not the physical demands. It's not even the operational stress. What is it? It's maintaining humility when everything in your world tells you you're exceptional. You are exceptional, you and your team. You've done things most people can't even imagine. But that exceptionalism can become a trap. It can make you forget that you're part of a continuum, not the beginning of it." Holloway stopped walking. "Is this an official counseling session, ma'am?" Mendoza smiled slightly. "No, this is a reminder that what happened this morning doesn't define you. How you handle the next few hours does. See you around, Staff Sergeant." She walked away, leaving Holloway standing alone in the corridor, her words echoing in his head. By noon, the entire Delta compound knew what had happened. In the Special Operations community, news spread through an invisible network of glances, brief conversations, and shared meals. Holloway's team found themselves on the receiving end of looks from other operators, some sympathetic, some judgmental, most just curious about how this would play out. They gathered in their team room, a spartanly furnished space with lockers, a planning table, and walls covered with maps and operational diagrams. Rodriguez sat on a bench, methodically cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time that morning. Chen was doing pull-ups in the corner, his face expressionless. Williams stared at his phone, reading something intently. "I found some articles about Mac v. Esog," Williams said quietly, breaking the silence. "If even half of what's written about them is true—" "It's probably true," Patterson interrupted. "My grandfather was in Nam, different unit, but he told me about SOG guys. Said they were either crazy or superhuman, and most of the time both. He said you could always tell them by their eyes. They'd seen things that aged them decades beyond their years." Brooks sat with his head in his hands. At 24, he was the youngest, and Holloway could see the kid was taking this especially hard. "I keep thinking about what we said, about stolen valor. God, I feel sick." "We all should," Jackson said, looking up from his laptop where he'd been doing his own research. I found a declassified after-action report from 1972, Operation Prairie Fire. Cunningham's name is mentioned, most of it's redacted, but what's there? He was recommended for the Medal of Honor. It was downgraded to a Silver Star because the mission officially never happened. Holloway closed his eyes. Every new piece of information was another stone added to the weight pressing down on his chest. You know what the worst part is? Rodriguez said, still not looking up from his rifle. We pride ourselves on being humble professionals. We don't brag. We don't seek attention. We do the job and move on. That's what makes us different from regular army, from the guys who need everyone to know how badass they are. And then we turned around and did exactly what we claimed to hate, Chen finished. We saw someone we didn't recognize, didn't understand his context, and immediately assumed we were better than him. The room fell silent again. This wasn't just about mockery or poor judgment. It was about violating the very principles they claimed to embody. At 13:30, Holloway made a decision. Gear up, he told his team. Full dress uniform. If we're doing this, we're doing it right. They changed in silence, trading their casual fatigues for the Class A uniforms they rarely wore. Ribbons and decorations lined their chests, bronze stars, purple hearts, combat action badges. Awards they'd earned through blood and sacrifice. Today, those decorations felt less like achievements and more like reminders that they should have known better. The conference was being held in Building 7, one of the secure facilities where classified briefings took place. As they approached, Holloway could see other personnel filtering in. Senior officers, intelligence analysts, a few special forces soldiers from other units. This wasn't a large gathering, maybe 40 people total, but every single one of them had the clearances necessary for whatever Cunningham was about to discuss. They entered the auditorium, and as ordered, took seats in the front row. The room was arranged theater-style, with a podium and screen at the front. Holloway felt exposed sitting there, aware that everyone entering would see them, would know who they were and what they'd done. Major General Thorne entered from a side door, surveying the room. His eyes found Holloway's team and held there for a moment before he nodded slightly. Acknowledgement. Not forgiveness. Then Walter Cunningham walked in. In the morning light of the mess hall, he'd seemed frail, a relic from another era. Here in his element, something shifted. He wore a simple sport coat and slacks, no uniform, no decorations. But the way he carried himself, the way he moved to the podium with deliberate purpose, commanded immediate respect. The quiet conversations in the room died instantly. Up close, Holloway could see details he'd missed before. Cunningham's hands were scarred in multiple places, the marks of a life spent in violence. His face was weathered, lined deeply, but his eyes were sharp, alert, missing nothing. Those eyes swept across the audience and paused when they reached the front row. Cunningham's gaze locked with Holloway's for just a moment. There was no anger there, no accusation, just evaluation. Holloway felt like he was being weighed and measured, and he wasn't sure he'd pass the test. "Good afternoon," Cunningham began, his voice surprisingly strong. "I'm here to talk about unconventional warfare tactics in denied territory, specifically lessons learned from Southeast Asia that remain relevant to modern operations." He clicked a remote, and the screen behind him lit up with a map of Laos and Cambodia, marked with routes and operational zones. Between 1967 and 1972, I ran cross-border operations into what we called Prairie Fire and Daniel Boone areas of operation. For those unfamiliar, these were reconnaissance and direct action missions into countries where American forces officially didn't exist. We operated in 6-man teams, sometimes 12 if the target warranted it, against enemy forces that outnumbered us by factors of hundreds or thousands to one. Cunningham's presentation style was matter-of-fact, almost casual, but the content was electrifying. He spoke of tactics that modern special operations units still used, immediate action drills, escape and evasion protocols, methods for calling in air support in triple canopy jungle. But more than that, he spoke about the psychological aspects of operating in complete isolation. where the nearest friendly forces were hours away and capture meant torture and death. The enemy knew we were there, Cunningham continued. They had entire units dedicated to tracking and killing recon teams. We called them trackers, NVA soldiers specially trained in counter-reconnaissance. They were patient, skilled, and absolutely ruthless. Engaging them meant you'd already failed your primary mission, which was to stay hidden. He showed grainy photographs, recently declassified, of terrain so dense that Holloway couldn't imagine navigating it, let alone fighting in it. On one mission, this would have been March of 1971, my team was tasked with locating a suspected POW camp in the Laotian Panhandle. We inserted at night, moved 3 clicks to our observation point and settled in. For 62 hours, we didn't move more than a few feet. We urinated into plastic bags. We defecated into our pants. We communicated entirely through hand signals and barely breathed. The room was absolutely silent. Even the most experienced operators present were hanging on every word. On the 3rd day, a company-sized element of NVA moved through our position. I'm talking about 150 soldiers passing within 10 feet of where we were hiding. One of my men, kid named Thompson, 20 years old, had a bee land on his face. It stung him 3 times. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, because any movement, any noise, would have gotten all 6 of us killed. Cunningham paused, and Holloway saw something flicker in the old man's eyes. Memory, grief, pride, all mixed together. We located the camp, called in the coordinates, and extracted it successfully. 3 weeks later, a raid was conducted. No POWs were found. They'd been moved, but the intelligence we gathered led to another camp being located where 23 American prisoners were recovered. He advanced to the next slide, showing a list of principles in stark white text against a black background. The lessons. Patience trumps aggression. Silence is survival. Ego will get you killed. And most importantly, the mission is bigger than any individual. Your job isn't to be a hero. It's to accomplish the objective and bring your team home. As Cunningham continued his presentation, walking through mission after mission, failure and success analyzed with clinical precision, Holloway felt something shifting inside him. This wasn't just a history lesson. It was a masterclass in humility, delivered by someone who had every right to be arrogant, but chose instead to be instructive. The old warrior wasn't here to impress them. He was here to teach them. And they'd almost missed it because they were too busy mocking his scars. Cunningham spoke for exactly 90 minutes, never once referring to notes, never once seeking sympathy or recognition. When he finished, the applause was immediate and sustained. Officers and operators who'd seen combat across multiple theaters stood out of respect for a man whose wars had ended before some of them were born. As the applause died down, Major General Thorne stood. Mr. Cunningham has agreed to take a few questions. Holloway's hand went up immediately. Cunningham's eyes found him. Yes, Staff Sergeant. Holloway stood, feeling every eye in the room on him. Sir, He stopped, forcing himself to meet Cunningham's gaze directly. This morning in the mess hall, my team disrespected you. We mocked your service without knowing anything about you. There's no excuse for what we did. I'm asking for the opportunity to apologize properly, sir. The room went dead quiet. Cunningham studied Holloway for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Apology accepted, Staff Sergeant. Sit down, sir, if I may, Holloway continued, but Cunningham held up a hand. I said, sit down, son. Holloway sat. The old man wasn't going to make this easy, and Holloway realized that was exactly what they deserved. The conference room slowly emptied as officers and operators filed out, still discussing Cunningham's presentation in hushed, reverent tones. Holloway's team remained seated in the front row, uncertain whether they'd been dismissed or if their penance required something more. Major General. Thorne approached the podium where Cunningham was collecting his materials. A few handwritten notes on index cards. Nothing more. The old warrior had delivered 90 minutes of detailed tactical analysis from memory alone. Walter, Thorne said, extending his hand. Outstanding presentation. Every operator in this room learned something today. Cunningham shook his hand with a slight smile. That's the goal, Robert, though I suspect some learned more than others. His eyes drifted to the 7 men still seated in the front row. Thorne followed his gaze. They've been waiting to speak with you properly, Thorne said. If you're willing. Cunningham was quiet for a moment, studying the young operators. Then he nodded. Send them up, Thorne gestured, and Holloway rose immediately, his team following. They approached the podium like men walking to the gallows, their earlier confidence completely evaporated. Up close, the differences in age were stark. Cunningham had to be 74, maybe 75. His skin was weathered like old leather, his white hair thinning. But those eyes, they held the same intensity Holloway had seen in his best sergeants, the ones who'd survived multiple combat tours and carried the weight of impossible decisions. Sir, Holloway began, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. I'm Staff Sergeant Marcus Holloway. This is my team. Rodriguez, Chen, Patterson, Williams, Jackson, and Brooks. What happened this morning was inexcusable. We judged you without knowledge, disrespected your service, and violated everything we claimed to stand for. We're asking for your forgiveness, but we understand if you can't give it. Cunningham regarded them in silence, letting the moment stretch. Finally, he spoke. You know what the real problem is? It's not that you mocked an old man's scar. Men like me, we've developed thick skin over the years. Words don't hurt us much anymore. He paused, and Holloway felt the weight of what was coming. The problem is that you assumed expertise gave you the right to judge. You've been through Delta selection, survived operations most soldiers will never see. That makes you dangerous, effective, valuable to your country. But it doesn't make you wise. Brooks shifted uncomfortably. Sir, I'm not finished, son. Cunningham's voice wasn't harsh, but it carried absolute authority. Brooks went silent immediately. When I was your age, Cunningham continued, I thought I knew everything too. I'd survived things that killed better men. I had medals I couldn't show anyone, and scars that told stories I couldn't share. I looked at World War II veterans, men who'd fought in the Pacific, stormed beaches in Normandy, and I thought, different war, different time. What do they know about what I do? He leaned against the podium, and for the first time, Holloway noticed the slight tremor in Cunningham's left hand, the arm with the scar. Then, in 1973, I met a man named James Mackenzie. He was 81 years old, living in a retirement home in Virginia. My commanding officer had sent me to interview him for a classified project on insurgency tactics. I went there thinking I was doing the old man a favor, letting him talk about the glory days before he died. Cunningham's expression shifted, something between regret and revelation. James Mackenzie had fought with the Philippine resistance during World War II, behind Japanese lines for 3 years, organizing guerrilla operations with nothing but captured weapons and homemade explosives. The stories he told me, the tactics, the psychological operations, the ways they turned entire villages into intelligence networks. I realized I'd been reinventing wheels he'd already perfected 30 years earlier. Rodriguez found his voice. What did you do? I shut my mouth and took notes for 6 hours straight. Then I came back the next day and did it again. And the day after that. For 2 weeks, I sat in that retirement home and learned from a man I'd initially dismissed as obsolete. Half the tactics that kept me alive in my later deployments came from him. He died 8 months after I met him. If I'd let my ego get in the way, all that knowledge would have died with him. The story landed like a physical blow. Holloway realized this wasn't just about their mistake. It was about a pattern that repeated across generations. Young warriors dismissing old ones until tragedy forced them to learn. Sir, Williams spoke up, the medic's voice careful. How do we avoid making that mistake again? Cunningham straightened, his posture shifting into something more formal, more instructional. You start by understanding that warfare is both timeless and constantly evolving. The technology changes, the weapons improve, but the fundamentals, fear, courage, sacrifice, brotherhood, those don't change. Every generation thinks they're the first to discover them, and every generation is wrong. He gestured toward the screen behind him, still showing the last slide of his presentation. You boys operate with night vision. Satellite communications, drones providing overwatch. We had maps, compasses, and radios that barely worked in triple canopy jungle. But the principle of moving through hostile territory undetected, that's been the same since Roman scouts infiltrated Germanic tribal lands 2,000 years ago. The technology is different. The principle is eternal. Chen, who rarely engaged in conversations like this, asked quietly, how do we bridge that gap between honoring what came before and adapting to what's current? Cunningham's eyes lit up, the look of a teacher who'd just heard the right question. You listen, you read. You seek out the old warriors, and you ask them questions, not about the glory and the medals, but about the mistakes, about what kept them up at night, about the decisions they got wrong, and the lessons they learned too late to save the men they lost. He walked closer to the team, his gait showing that old Hitch Holloway had noticed in the mess hall. Every scar tells a story, gentlemen. Mine. He touched his left forearm absently. This one taught me that heroism and stupidity often look identical in the moment. I climbed that tree because I had to, but I also stayed exposed for 30 seconds longer than necessary because I was angry, because I wanted to kill the bastards who'd shot down our helicopter. Those 30 seconds cost me full use of this arm for the rest of my life. The vulnerability in that admission was stunning. Here was a man with nothing left to prove, sharing not his triumphs but his failures. Rodriguez, you're from Texas, correct? Cunningham asked suddenly. Rodriguez straightened. Yes, sir. San Antonio. You know Fort Sam Houston? Yes, sir. Did some training there. There's a small cemetery on the grounds. Not many people visit it anymore, but there's a headstone there for a man named Samuel Griffin. He was a buffalo soldier, fought in the Indian Wars, then in the Philippines during the insurrection. Died in 1924. Last time I checked, his grave was covered in weeds because people forgot he existed. Cunningham's voice took on an edge. Samuel Griffin survived battles that would make your Somalia operation look like a training exercise. He fought enemies who gave no quarter, in terrain that made the Hindu Kush look friendly, with equipment that would be considered primitive even by World War I standards. And now nobody remembers his name. The point hit home. In 50 years, would anyone remember their names, their operations, their sacrifices? The lesson isn't that you should feel guilty, Cunningham said, his voice softening. Guilt is useless. The lesson is that you should feel responsibility to honor what came before, to learn from it, and to pass it on to whoever comes after you. Patterson spoke up, his voice thick with emotion. Sir, how do we make this right? Not just with you, but in general? Cunningham smiled for the first time since they'd approached him, a genuine smile that transformed his weathered face. You already are, son. You stood up in front of 40 people and admitted you were wrong. That takes a different kind of courage than what you show in combat. Most men never develop it. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook, the kind soldiers had carried for generations. Its cover stained and edges frayed. This belonged to my team leader, a man named Robert Sullivan. He was killed in Laos in 1971, died covering our extraction. Before every mission, he'd write down one thing he'd learned from the previous operation. Not tactics or enemy movements, but lessons about leadership, about character, about being a better man. Cunningham opened the notebook, its pages filled with tight, careful handwriting. After he died, I kept it. Started adding my own entries. When I retired, I thought about throwing it away. Thought maybe it was time to let go of the past. But then I realized this notebook wasn't about the past. It was about continuity, about the unbroken chain of warriors trying to do better than the generation before them. He held it out toward Holloway. I'm giving this to you, Staff Sergeant. Read it, add to it. When your time comes to step away from the teams, pass it to someone else who needs to learn what we've all had to learn the hard way. That being a warrior is about more than how well you shoot or how far you can run. It's about character, humility, and understanding that you're part of something bigger than yourself. Holloway took the notebook with both hands, feeling the weight of it, not just the physical weight, but the burden of responsibility it represented. "Sir, I don't know if I'm worthy of this." "None of us are," Cunningham replied. "That's the point. We carry it anyway and do our best to honor it. Some days we succeed, some days we fail. But we keep trying." The old warrior turned to address all 7 of them. "You boys made a mistake this morning. A bad one. But mistakes are only failures if you don't learn from them. You want to make this right? Go back to your teams, to your units, and be better. When you see a veteran, any veteran from any war, treat them with the respect they've earned. Not because of their rank or their decorations, but because they walked a path you're still walking, and they survived it." Major General Thorne, who'd been standing silently to the side, stepped forward. "Gentlemen, you're dismissed. Mr. Cunningham, thank you again for your time." As Holloway's team turned to leave, Cunningham called out one more time, "Staff Sergeant." Holloway turned back. "Your team in Somalia, everyone made it home?" "Yes, sir." "Complete success?" Cunningham nodded slowly. "Then you've already learned the most important lesson. The mission matters, but bringing your people home matters more. Don't ever forget that." "I won't, sir." As they left the conference room, walking out into the late afternoon sun, none of them spoke. Holloway clutched Sullivan's notebook against his chest, feeling the weight of generations of warriors who'd carried similar lessons, similar scars, similar regrets. Brooks finally broke the silence. "I'm going to visit that cemetery. Fort Sam Houston. Find Samuel Griffin's grave. We'll go together," Rodriguez said immediately. "All of us." And as they walked back toward their compound, 7 elite operators who'd started the day thinking they knew everything. Holloway realized they'd just been given a gift more valuable than any medal or commendation, the gift of perspective, delivered by a man who had every reason to reject them, but chose instead to teach them. The real battle, he understood now, wasn't just against enemy forces in foreign lands. It was against ego, against arrogance, against the belief that your generation had discovered courage when in truth you'd simply inherited it from men whose names you'd never know. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.